Stewart Mott is a philanthropist, not a run-of-the-mill philanthropist, but one whose style and benefaction seem designed to tweak the tilted nose of philanthropy and its conventions. He is decidedly his own man. The source of his considerable wealth is his late father, Charles Stewart Mott, a pioneer in the General Motors family, its largest single stockholder, and the patriarch of the city of Flint, Michigan. The younger Mott not only chose a lifestyle that contrasted sharply with his father's, but chose his benefactions with equal deliberateness: peace, population control, liberal political candidates, and a score of lesser-known but equally liberal causes. His bachelor quarters in a New York penthouse contains what is probably the largest vegetable and flower garden in Manhattan, giving him the space and light to indulge another of his singular interests. Stewart, do you find wealth a burden, an opportunity, or both?
Never thought of it very much as a burden, because it provides me with so many opportunities to function well. I think that the social concern that comes with the wealth can be burdensome. I mean, in as much as I
mean, it's hard to spend money and spend it properly?
Well, that's true, but the fact is that I am so conscientious about it that I wind up putting in 10, 12, 14-hour days and don't go away for holidays nearly as much as I should.
Yeah, well, it's perhaps a silly question, but what do you do for 10 or 12 hours a day in order to spend or give away money in this particular case?
Well, typically you'd see me on the telephone about 5 or 6 of those hours, and rummaging through a very deep pile of paper for another 5 or 6 hours, or on a shuttle flight to Washington, or in a meeting with some of the lawyers and other groups that I work with, both in Washington and New York.
Are you besieged with requests for gifts?
Well, only in part, but more important to me is the reading and research that I have to keep up with in the chosen areas which I'm pursuing.
That sounds as though you take the initiative for the most part.
Well, it's true. Virtually no one who just writes a letter or knocks on my door and says, "Hey, Stewart Mott, I've got a great project." I can't really help those people. I can maybe suggest where they might go seeking assistance, but I find that a lot of people have a mortgage to pay, a child to put through college, a variety of entirely worthwhile personal needs, and then others have their Boy Scout camp or their hospital research program. It's more than I can cope with, and I really want to define philanthropy for myself and not just be responsive to other people.
This means that you have a program of your own. You've outlined, at least in your own mind, whether specifically or only generally, what you want to do with that money.
Well, my program has evolved in the last 10 or 15 years. I initially defined the most important areas of philanthropic work in the realm of birth control and arms control. And during the 1960s, I directed myself in that way. Lately, in the last 5 years or so, the government has intervened and provided major funding for international population programs. We do have better contraceptive research now, and I feel it less necessary for an individual to use a large portion of his wealth for that purpose.
Well, traditionally, that's been the role of philanthropy, hasn't it? To take the risk, the gamble, and then let somebody else take over when it gets going.
Especially when the program is unpopular and controversial, and where perhaps it is not a fit arena in which government should function, as indeed in the 1950s and before, contraceptives and abortion were deemed by general public opinion to be unworthy of federal support until legislators came around. Now hundreds of millions of dollars are being put into the population field. That's not to say that Planned Parenthood doesn't warrant continued support. I'm still an advocate and still work with Planned Parenthood and do give modestly to it each year. So I want to put in a plug for the organization that I grew up with. But in the last 5 or 6 years, my work has taken a turn more toward the political and governmental reform.
Do you have any reservations about the power that you can wield? It's certainly beyond what the average citizen can wield in influencing the kinds of things in which he believes. You can influence your own convictions with the power of the money that you can put behind those convictions. Isn't that an awesome kind of power?
Well, it may be, but I think I conduct myself with a certain amount of accountability. I have disclosed the sources of my wealth and my assets in talk shows like this and newspaper accounts, and I think that I should be held accountable as a public figure. If I were sitting behind a screen of assistants and behind closed doors, giving away millions of dollars each year without any disclosure in an anonymous fashion, why then I think there should be many people alarmed about that kind of philanthropy. But I'm very upfront about it. I try to define for public view what my priorities are, and let people criticize me if they disagree, and indeed they do.
Do you change? Are you affected by criticism and in the directions in which you might go?
Well, I can't name any one particular example, though certainly I was going against the majority public opinion when I started my advocacy of abortion reform, and now, lo and behold, the majority opinion has swung in favor of making abortion available on demand. So I have to be sensitive to public opinion. In fact, I'm currently subscribing to the Roper Reports as one of their clients in order to get a better touch as to what the public thinks.
Do you operate as a foundation or as an individual?
Well, I did function through a foundation until 1969, when the Tax Reform Act made it rather difficult for a person to function freely within the foundation domain. I find that being able to give directly and personally, I can act a lot more expeditiously than through foundation channels.
And you're accountable only to yourself in that respect, then, not to a board of directors or distribution committee or whatever.
Oh, well, that's true. Of course, many foundations are so-called personal foundations, and a donor with his secretary and lawyer manage the foundation, and so there is no accountability in that either. But since I have an annual income, roughly $500,000 to $600,000 per year to give away, why...
That's the part you give away.
That's right.
So there's an additional income to support you, and I suppose supports the activity as well.
Yes, that's true. My gross income is on the order of $1 million to $1.2 million each year. And I give away fully 50%, sometimes a little in excess of that, to philanthropic activities, and then another $100,000 to $200,000 a year average for political activities, which is not deductible.
How did you arrive at that 50%? Was that arbitrary on your part?
Well, that's the maximum that is allowable under the tax laws as a deduction. And then I sometimes go a little bit beyond that because there's certain things that I especially want to support. And by the way, it's not through phony giving, such as our president has done with his papers, giving them to the archives. I give tangible assets that can be used by philanthropy.
Still, when I ask you about wealth being a burden or an opportunity, I also thought in terms of some years ago, when you were growing up as a very young man. You grew up in the midst of considerable wealth, since your father was himself a wealthy man. His wealth was wealth that he himself earned, was he not? He did not inherit from his own father, so that you're the second generation, I gather.
Right.
Did it in any way dissuade you from what you might have wished to be as a young man, or was it something that was accepted and you grew up with it, was comfortable with it,
Well, the presence of wealth was not excessively felt in my hometown of Flint, Michigan. Yes, it was clear that my father was the wealthiest man in town, and through his foundation, he had an edifice complex, and a lot of the buildings there were named for him. I grew up aware of this, but there was a lifestyle that was marked with a kind of Scottish austerity. My father would turn off the extra lights in the living room, even though we didn't have an energy crisis then, and would drive a small compact car. He had a little bumper sticker, "I love my Corvair."
And he had access, I suppose, to any kind of car he wanted as a member of the board of General Motors.
And he enjoyed driving himself, so he didn't need a chauffeur, and we didn't have a butler waiting upon every need. I learned to do things for myself, and
he saw to that, I suppose, and as you were raised in an environment where you were expected to do much on your own?
For spending money, for example, I think I worked in the vegetable garden harvesting peas and then later shelling them for 5 cents or 10 cents per hour, and that's the way I had to earn my weekly allowance.
Were you brought up always with the tacit understanding that you would go into the family business, would inherit the responsibility, or was it ever thought of? You were one of, what, 6 children,
That's
I believe,
right.
and one of, in a sense, 2 families. Your father was well along in his years when you were born, so it wasn't the kind of close-knit family, I suppose, that one normally thinks of.
Well, it was just the contrary of what you might expect. I perceive that the Rockefeller family does quite a good job of introducing their children and grandchildren into professional philanthropy. In fact, I talked at length with John D. Rockefeller III about this very question of how the younger generation is trained into it. And they're often, those Rockefeller kids seem to be a little excessively burdened with a sense of responsibility and conscientious service to the public. In my family, unfortunately, there was scarcely any talk of that at all. My father expected me to be a businessman, an engineer, to study practical things like mechanical engineering, which he studied, and he probably would have been most pleased had I decided to go into General Motors or into some corporation of my own choosing and make my own mark in the business world, which is what he understood best and most admired. It wasn't until I was about 18 or so that I really became aware of the wealth that might be available to me and to public service as an alternative career. And I decided that someday I wanted to devote myself to public service. And rather than just building up pile upon pile and creating a bigger fortune, I decided that my responsibility was to preserve what we had and to see that it was creatively spent. I don't think you can do both altogether successfully in spending half of one's time in the business world and half of one's time in the world of government reform and political reform.
So it wasn't a rejection of the idea of going into business for yourself, but rather a choice of public service.
Well, that's not to say I wasn't very interested in the business world, and
You did start working in your father's business when you were quite young,
That's
did you?
right. I spent many summers in it, and I spent a full year visiting the various corporations that are owned by the Mott family. And I did my bachelor's degree in business management. Presently, I manage my own portfolio. I've got a very good eye for accounting and the tax laws. And I spend about 1 or 2 or 3 days per month reviewing the work of my portfolio managers. And I'm fascinated by it, but I just don't want it to be consuming too much time in my life.
Much was made in a profile about you in New Yorker magazine of the differences between you and your father, who's since died. Did you ever reconcile those differences? Your lifestyles, of course, were quite far apart.
I came to the conclusion finally that they were irreconcilable. He, a conservative Republican with a very cautious business outlook, who decided to spend his philanthropy in a small town in Michigan, which has become somewhat gold-plated because of the beneficence of the Mott Foundation. And I, in contrast, a liberal Democrat who has been seeking out the business ventures that are high risk and high yield, and where my philanthropy is maybe shooting pebbles into a huge pond, but in trying to correct the population problem and slow down the arms race, I think that there's no greater problem facing this world, and my modest annual contribution in these arenas can only go a little way toward solving the problems, but there are dollars spent a lot more cost effectively than gilding the lily in Flint, Michigan.
Were you ever conscious of deliberately building a lifestyle, a political conviction that was opposite to your father's, as any young person might do, just because his father stood here, he wanted to stand there? Or were there other forces and influences on your life that caused you to become the liberal Democrat rather than conservative Republican?
Well, sure, there were other influences, and at important moments in my life, I met Norman Thomas and Roger Baldwin and Alan Guttmacher and
not through your father,
Ernest Greening. No, but I think I was already moving in that direction on my own. I can't say exactly why. For a period from age 18 to 25, I did my best to try to get interested in the Flint program. And at one point, I even told my father, look, give me a chance to work with you here in your foundation in Flint, and let me work as a consultant, a management analyst, and go around to the different aspects of the program and see where I can identify ways in which the dollars can go farther, a cost-effectiveness study. And unfortunately, he turned me down on the offer. He said that he thought I should go pursue my own field, and I think basically he said that because he didn't want any flack from me when he backtalked, telling him that he was perhaps not spending his money as well, as effectively as he could.
He didn't suspect that your interest in what you call public service was the avoidance of work.
Good grief. I should hope not. I mean, we didn't have much contact with each other in the last 4 or 5 years, but during my 20s, my lifestyle was such that I was working 12, 14-hour days when I visited the companies that we control. I was, for example, at the department stores in Michigan, staying at the stores until the 9 o'clock closing, counting the tapes to see what departments produced how much each day, and then going home and reading Women's Wear Daily and Home Furnishings Daily before falling to sleep.
Stuart, when you were 20 years old, you made a trip to South Europe and into Asia that seems to have had some influence upon you, too. You said, or quoted again in the New Yorker profile, as saying it was the freest time. For the first time in your life, you felt truly free. You were on your own, traveling, I guess, almost living by your wits in some respects, were you not?
Well, I took that year off between my what was supposed to be my junior year and senior year at college, and made it around the world on a total budget of $1,500 and a simple knapsack and satchel. The freest moment came, I think, when I had sold the car I had bought in Europe, and I was heading out across the eastern desert of Iran, and had just left Tehran. All I had were my knapsack and satchel and $50 in my pocket, and a map that stretched only halfway across the Persian desert. And I knew about 50 words of the language, and I knew generally that Afghanistan was over that direction somewhere, and I wanted to visit this country, which was legendary, supposedly 300 years behind the rest of the world. And I sat there for an hour on the main highway leading east, and not a single vehicle passed, and I felt a tremendous sense of adventure. I was 20 years old at the time, and I knew that I'd be coming back to the United States and back to responsibilities, but I had fully a year ahead of me for that kind of life.
So you discovered something about yourself in that process, I suppose?
Yes. For one, I realized that people should go through a rather radical change of life every 6 or 7 years, and not just continue doing the routine motions over and over again. And in a way, I did take another sabbatical in 1971. For about 6 months, I decided I had absolutely had it with the telephones and the daily flow of papers here in New York. And I shut it all out and decided that I would spend the following 6 months in gardening, and in fact did study the seed catalogs and poked the seeds into the seed flats and learned just how to tend for vegetables and flowers, and developed what I immodestly would like to call New York's most extensive penthouse farm, including chickens for fresh eggs daily.
And you're in the process of building a magnificent new penthouse farm that's going to cost over $1 million that will allow you to do even more farming on top of this newly constructed penthouse, I gather.
Well, by about the summer of 1975, I hope to have a unique penthouse arrangement where my philanthropic office and my home will be merged into one location. The new penthouse will be heliotropically oriented with a
turning toward the sun.
Yes, with an eye to having the planting arrangement in such a fashion that every plant gets the kind of light that it needs. Hard to do in an existing
What's the passion
penthouse.
for plants?
Well, it's, as Ralph Nader told me recently, my attempt to have nature defy the laws of man here in Manhattan. It's to, in effect, demonstrate that Manhattan can be livable, and to bring the country into the city instead of vice versa. I'd rather not have a second home out in East Hampton or somewhere with the 2 hours on the expressway back and forth every weekend. I'd rather have the jungle-like experience surrounding me in the city. I'd also like it to be a place where young people can come to visit. I'd like to be able to bring in school groups maybe once a week and show the kids from Harlem and Brownsville what it's like to grow a turnip or a carrot or a tomato. Many of them have never seen a tomato vine.
It may only prove what most of us have known for some time, Stewart, which is that Manhattan is livable if you've got the money.
Well, I'd like to demonstrate that you don't have to have all that much money either, because part of my garden is what I call a free garden. It's a section where I'm using wooden crates and discarded automobile tires, large tomato cans, tins, and the like, and I'm composting all of the droppings from the kitchen, all the recyclable organic material, and through the compost pile, I see each spring plants volunteering, just sprouting up like from a tomato seed that was discarded. And you don't even have to spend 15 cents for a package of seed in doing this. And I'd like to demonstrate visually, physically, that people can have rooftop gardens at zero expense. And everybody has a rooftop. I think rooftops are the most wasted part of Manhattan real estate. And each one of them could be a mini paradise, a vegetable patch every summer.
I want to ask you about another of your interests, peace. You've been interested in peace, so I am told, from a very early age. And at the point where you could do so, you became a conscientious objector. Now you spend some of your money in the cause for peace.
Well, it's true. In about age 19 or 20, when I first had a rifle thrust in my hand at the ROTC class at MIT, I recoiled and determined that if I were ever up for conscription, that I would be a CEO. I got alarmed about the drift of the American involvement in Vietnam back in 1965 and called one of our first town hall meetings in Flint, Michigan on the subject. Unfortunately, I came across the flyer for that town hall meeting recently, and I realized that many of the same identical questions that were raised in 65 were still left unanswered even today. And yes, I helped to finance the Vietnam protest movement, the moratorium. I worked in Gene McCarthy's campaign and subsequently with George McGovern, and have come to the conclusion gradually that the only way to accomplish substantial political reform is to spend an enormous amount of time working on campaigns for candidates of the right type.
How do you feel about persons like yourself giving large amounts of money to political campaigns. Do you think this is the proper way to finance political campaigns?
I think it's entirely appropriate so long as it's adequately disclosed. I think our disclosure laws should go farther than what they do. I think that those who decide to give in excess of, say, $3,000 should be obliged to make a full and appropriate financial statement indicating in what ways that they personally or their companies they control have dealings with the federal government, whether they are subject to regulation by any of the various commissions, whether they are subject to any act of Congress, such as in the price of milk. Then let people give what they see fit. Let them give extravagantly and excessively.
With no upper limit.
And let the candidate spend money foolishly if he or she so chooses. But I don't think there should be an artificial limit either on the amount that an individual can give nor on the amount that a candidate can spend. But I think we also need public financing. And the most attractive formula that has been proposed thus far is the Udall-Anderson formula, which provides for matching monies from the federal till to up to the first $50 that each donor gives, so that a person who is beginning his or her campaign with just small gifts will have a chance to get started, and it's not entirely reliant upon the fat cat donor.
Stewart, one final question, very brief. Many of our guests have been concerned with the necessity, sometimes the difficulty, of defining themselves. Have you come to the point where you know who you are? Have you gotten a self-definition for yourself?
In a single word, I look upon myself as a maverick.
Is that a kind of profession?
No, that's a cow that ran free in Texas and Oklahoma that belonged to Colonel Maverick back in the last century, and he refused to brand his calves, and I refused to be branded myself. Though I call myself a liberal Democrat and a philanthropist and a social activist, I really would prefer to go with that label.
Thank you very much.